Concerning the Reconstruction of the Aramaic Gospels by David Daube, LL.D, PhD, Fellow of Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, reprinted from the Bulletin of the John Rylands Library, Volume 29, Number 1, July 1945. Description of this particular book. Critical response to Charles Cutler Torrey's The Four Gospels, 1933, in our translated Gospels, some of the evidences. 1936, Torrey claims the Greek Gospels are early and good translations from the Aramaic originals. Maybe it's saying it's from the Koine Greek, which is akin to the original Aramaic, Galilean Aramaic, etc. So good that the Semitic colloquialisms are literally preserved. This revolutionary claim clears up many questions, yet Daube raises some objections within this book. So who is this David Daube in his lifetime? He was awarded FBA, which is Fellowship of the British Academy, an award granted by the British Academy to leading academics for their distinction in the humanities and social sciences. The categories are fellows, scholars, residents in the United States or the United Kingdom, possibly the United States. So he was born 8 February 1909 in Freiburg, Germany, died 24 February 1999 in Berkeley, California, USA. He was the 20th century's preeminent scholar of ancient law. He combined a familiarity with many legal systems, particularly Roman law and biblical law, with an expertise in Greek, Roman, Jewish and Christian literature, and used literary, religious and legal texts to illuminate each other and, among other things, to transform the position of Roman law and to launch a revolution or near revolution in New Testament studies. And history about his life. In 1970, at the height of his career, he left his fellowship at All Souls College and his chair, Regius Professor of Civil Law, Oxford, and moved to California, USA, where he became professor in residence at UC Berkeley's Law School, then known as Bausch Hall, where he taught for the rest of his life, and he remarried in 1986. Daube's teachers include Otto Lienel, a German Jewish jurist and legal historian. His most important achievements are in the field of Roman law. He founded a new area of research, the study of interpolations. He identified numerous interpolations to original texts and so forth. And he encouraged David Daube to take up the study of legal history in the first place, according to Daube's notes in his first published book, Studies in Biblical Law. Daube goes on to thank Professor Johannes Hempel and Wolfgang Kunkel of Göttingen, a prominent German historian of Roman law, who stressed the importance of Roman social history in understanding Roman law institutions, who trained Daube in rigorous scholarly methods. The influence of C.H. Dodd, whom Daube first met at Cambridge, a Welsh New Testament scholar and influential Protestant theologian. He is known for promoting realized eschatology, the belief that Jesus' references to the kingdom of God meant a present reality rather than a future apocalypse. Whom Daube first met at Cambridge, guided Daube all his life. Also at Cambridge, F.S. Marsh and Stanley A. Cook were important influences on Daube. And finally, Professor William Warwick Buckland, also FBA, was a scholar of Roman law, Regius Professor of Civil Law at the University of Cambridge from 1914 to 1945. And he did studies of biblical law. The first chapter of Daube's first major book, Studies of Biblical Law, titled Law and the Narratives, phrased in polite language, nonetheless starts with a revolutionary claim. All scholars since Henry Maine, a British fig comparative jurist and historian. He is famous for the thesis outlined in his book Ancient Law, that law and society developed from status to contract. Who they say that there is no separation of law and religion in primitive or ancient legal systems. But Daube notes this is a generalization based upon the study of law in the Bible, and the Bible, after all, is a collection of literature arranged by priests and prophets. They, naturally enough, he continues, subordinated law to religion. Indeed, they represented legal rules as religious rules, destined to guide God's chosen people. But he asks, is it safe to argue that because the devout authors of the Bible saw law as part of religion, law must have formed part of religion in the Hebrew state? In answering this, he says legal historians must go beyond the Bible using the comparative method. But, adds Daube, this application of the comparative method is not enough, because the Bible is an anthology compiled by priests and prophets who are neither competent nor even desirous to formulate an accurate exposition of Hebrew law. One must first find out something about the true Hebrew law, separating it from the dress in which priests and prophets have handed it down to us, like assembling a jigsaw puzzle from scattered fragments. The result of such an inquiry would likely show that the religious character of the law was not originally in it, but due to the theological tendencies of the authors of the Bible. Why, he concludes, should one assume that the law sprang from religion rather than religion from law? This question marks an important step. Biblical legal scholarship is not to be confined to pious exegesis of a text whose sacred character always makes its status primary. Rather, biblical law is a field of legal study, of rational inquiry, like any other field of legal study, and must be approached with the same analytical tools and methods. Moreover, the sacred text is not the authoritative statement of Hebrew law, for priestly transmission has disordered the law that had an independent existence in the Israelite state. That law must be recovered from the biblical narratives by careful juristic analysis. Daube begins with examples of how that recovery ought to take place. He first looks at the narrative of Joseph and his brothers, showing how it can be understood in the context of principles of the law of custodianship, which provide the implicit legal categories utilized by the text and determine the contours of the action it recounts. And off he goes, inaugurating 50 years of path-breaking scholarship. And it goes on about his work and maybe some critics. David Daube focused on this above in his tribute to his teacher on his death. Daube was his teacher. It is the complexity in David that made him so magical. It is not surprising then that this is was his most Jewish of scholars, who taught us that Christianity is a New Testament Judaism, a strikingly pregnant phrase that he invented and which sums up best perhaps his legacy and the near revolution that he introduced into New Testament studies. In 1962, Daube gave the Gifford lectures on natural theology, and he had his students, a pedagogy, whatever that is, and somebody testifies about it. His education, his career, his other posts and honours, and many of his publications, books, and so forth. And some of them might be edited by these people, edited chapters, and these journal articles, Schriften, whatever that is in German, memorable volumes and references. So that's the history of David Daube. Back to his book concerning the reconstruction of the Aramaic Gospels. So let's have a look at that. Concerning the reconstruction of the Aramaic Gospels by David Daube, fellow of such and such a college, Cambridge. 1. Torrey's translation of the Gospels. You must be critiquing it here. It is sometimes maintained that the four Gospels as they have come down to us are straightforward translations of Aramaic originals, with the exception indeed of a few small portions. Recently, at this particular time when he was writing this, probably studying, researching and writing it, recently this view had found a brilliant and highly competent advocate in C.C. Torrey. It is not the present writer's, or this author's, object to investigate this vast problem, though it may be permissible to express respectful disagreement. So, again, he doesn't agree on what the C.C. Torrey has to say, saying it came from the Aramaic originals. Certainly, it is highly unlikely that Jesus used Greek when talking to his disciples or preaching. Okay? Jesus probably unlikely that he did speak Greek to his disciples. Probably spoke his native language and their native language, because Peter was a Galilean, etc., which is a Galilean Aramaic. Or even that he knew a great deal of Greek. he's the Son of God, so he'd probably know all those languages, right? But he probably didn't use it only when maybe he was selling some sort of furniture or something, right? Being a son of a carpenter. This point has perhaps received too little attention from those who have speculated upon the trial of Jesus before Pilate or Pilate. That scene will appear nonetheless pathetic if we assume the presence of an interpreter. There must therefore have existed a nucleus of sayings and stories in Aramaic, but it has been convincingly argued that Greek versions of these, or many of these, were current from an early date and were used by the evangelists or even their sources. Probably some narratives and sayings to be found in the Gospels were in Greek from the outset. The truth seems to be that the problem does not admit of a uniform solution to be stated in a few words. The proportion of Aramaic, Greek and other elements, for there are others, among which Hebrew is prominent, varies from one pericope to the next, and quite often one verse to the next. As for the Aramaic gold, while that may here and there be almost on the surface, as a rule we have to dig through several layers, some of them deep and hard enough to render the work laborious, to reach it, and not infrequently we shall toil all in vain, much as did the inhabitants of the shores of the Rhine, in Germany, right, who fascinated, as the midnight moon did lave her forehead in the silver wave, searched their river for the legendary treasure of the Nibelungen. Okay, the author here has a footnote saying he wished to thank Professor F.S. Marsh for criticism and advice of what he was had written there. He's going to write and publish, right? Here a much narrower subject will be discussed. Torrey has given us a new English translation of the Gospels, and there's some reference to his books down below. A translation based on the theory mentioned at the beginning of this paper, and he has explained his deviations from previous renderings not only in numerous notes appended to this translation, but also in a separate, more recent work, Our Translated Gospels by C.C. Torrey. In the latter, he classifies his deviations in order to show what kinds of mistakes we have to expect in a Greek work coming direct from the Aramaic. It may be said to be the purpose of the following remarks to point out some of the mistakes that we have to expect in a work like Torrey's. More precisely, Torrey, for whom the Gospels are immediate versions of Aramaic originals, is inclined to blame the translator into Greek for any difficulties in the text before us, inclined to solve any problems by alleging that the Aramaic was in order, only the translator into Greek misunderstood it. This procedure has its great dangers, whether Torrey's main thesis is tenable or not. No doubt some passages in the Gospels may owe their present form to mistranslation of an Aramaic original, but it is easy to exaggerate, and except for certain particularly favourable cases, impossible to achieve reconstructions that can be regarded as authoritative. A phrase that looks odd at first sight may yet turn out to be in its proper place. On close examination of, say, the rabbinic background, if we assume mistranslation in such a case, we should only have made the text suit our modern notions instead of arriving at its true meaning. And who knows enough about the Aramaic of 1st century Palestine, the little personal peculiarities in the Aramaic of, say, the hypothetical Aramaic Matthew, and those in the Aramaic of the man who made him into Greek, to be able to reconstruct with authority. The writer happens to have seen a large number of reconstructions of texts from the digest supposed to have suffered under the hands of Tribonian, whoever he was, Justinian's Minister of Justice, when he compiled that code from the works of the famous jurists of the first 2.5 centuries. But it is greatly to be feared that few of them would cause the original authors anything but annoyance. Yet the task is considerably less complicated than in the case of the Gospels, since both Tribonian and the classical jurists whose work he handled wrote in Latin. The great Roman lawyer Otto Lenel, in the course of discussing similar questions, pointed out of the German synonyms da and veil, or veil. The former was to be found hundreds of times in his own writings, the latter hardly at all. So Daube was to be found heaps in his writings, hundreds of times, and Weil wasn't, hardly at all. An interesting and by no means unique example of personal preference for one of two equally good words. The pitfalls here referred to are only a few out of the great many in the way of him who would rely chiefly on the possibility of mistranslation in dealing with difficulties in the Gospels. This is not saying that no account should be taken of that possibility. Far from it. It remains an undoubted merit of Torrey's to have revived interest in a method too often neglected. What it is sought to demonstrate is first that only good can come of a certain reluctance to assume mistranslations. And there's a footnote indicated down the bottom which says the present writer himself has sinned against this principle in expository times. Page 50, paragraph 138f, though he has made it clear that his treatment of Mark 2:4 and Luke 5:19 is not meant to provide more than a conceivable solution of a difficulty which may not exist. What is sought to demonstrate is first that only good can come of a certain reluctance to assume mistranslations, and secondly that reconstructions are apt to go wrong. Unfortunately, even where one does not agree with it, an explanation by Torrey, it is often impossible to disprove it. In Aramaic, sometimes the same words may express either a declaration or a question. Torrey says that in Luke 16:8, if the Aramaic signified, "Did the Lord of the estate praise his faithless manager?" and that was the translator into Greek who is responsible for the troublesome, and the Lord commended the unjust steward. And that's from the Four Gospels, paragraph 157 and 311. Our translated Gospels, paragraph 56, 5.9f. The present writer prefers a traditional version just because it is so inconvenient, but this means only that he does not approve of Torrey's suggestion, not that he had refuted it. He's just saying, well, that's not right. He's not saying, you took a load of bunk. He hasn't put it down, right? Or put the author down. It's a response. Nevertheless, there are cases where Torrey's treatment can at least be shown to be very problematic, and it is to a discussion of some of these that the following pages within this book will be devoted. This inquiry then is not concerned with the wider question whether or not the Four Gospels are straightforward translations of Aramaic originals. 2 points, however, may be noted. For one thing, should it be possible to prove mistaken significant explanations of Torrey, one's view of his main thesis will inevitably be affected, in however slight a degree. For another thing, even where something like a mistranslation appears established, we must remember that it may have occurred at a stage of the tradition far prior to the evangelist translator. Frequently it may have occurred before any translation was made, so we ought to think of misinterpretation of an Aramaic passage by one who handed it on in Aramaic rather than of mistranslation of an Aramaic passage by one who handed it on in Greek. According to Matthew 14:2, Mark 6:14, the powers work in him, John the Baptist. It's referring to John the Baptist. Torrey contends that the Aramaic, or maybe that's a quote by John the Baptist, there was some sort of hint there. Torrey contends that the Aramaic used a form which, if written without vowels, could mean that, or could mean this, or the deeds are worked by him, passive. That in this context only the latter meaning can have been intended, and that the translated into Greek mistranslated. And that's according to his book, The Four Gospels, and our translated Gospels. But even if the first two steps of this argument are conceded, there is nothing to prevent us from assuming that it was at the Aramaic stage itself that the form was misunderstood and replaced by one signifying only the powers work in him, active. It follows that even when something like a mistranslation appears established, special evidence is required if we are to be certain that it was the evangelist translator himself who committed the mistake. A fair proportion of the mistranslations alleged by Torrey, even if believed in, are not of the type that can be ascribed only to the last or indeed, to any translator into Greek. However, as the wider issue is not raised in this paper, this consideration will not be pursued by this particular author, right? Daube. The object of these reflections, as already stated, is quite unambitious, to demonstrate that much care should be exercised in inferring mistranslations and attempting reconstructions. So he's saying, you should always take care when you're relating to obvious mistranslations and then trying to reconstruct the whole translation, right? It's what we believe he's trying to put across. The Aramaic Gospels, chapter 2, Matthew 5:37. Let us begin with Matthew 5:37. Torrey's allegation of a mistranslation is unfounded. An analysis of the rabbinic background shows that the passage, if not superior to its parallel, or to an equivalent, we guess, James 5:12, is certainly not the result of clumsiness on the part of a translator. Matthew 5:37, as it stands, says, "But let your communication be yea, or yeah, or yes, and your nay, your no be no, or nay. Torrey substitute, but let your words yes be yeah, and your nay be nay, word by word, but the result is mistranslation. The second occurrence of the yeah or nay is in each case a predicate." James 5:12 has it right. But the matter is a little more complicated than that. True, we might readily conceive of an Aramaic original, the meaning of which was as Torrey supposes, though it could also be interpreted, or rather on this hypothesis, misinterpreted, in the way chosen by the Greek translator. True, James 5:12 has a version speaking for Torrey, but let your yeah be yeah and your nay, nay. Yet when we inspect the rabbinic parallels, the result is strongly in favour of the Matthew text before us. According to Matthew 5:33, WF, you have to avoid oaths. You may swear neither by heaven, nor by the earth, nor by Jerusalem, nor by your head. You can't do that, right? That's what it's saying there. And you may go no further. If we accept the traditional text, then an emphatic yeah, or nay. James 5:12 ends on a somewhat different note. You have to avoid oaths. You may swear neither by, we're saying you don't swear by heaven, nor by the earth, nor by any other oath. The most ordinary assurance coming from you should be good enough. This let your yeah be yeah and your nay be nay, Torrey takes as having been behind Matthew 5:37 as well. Now it is clear from the rabbinic discussion of oaths that people were afraid to use the name of God. This is what these rabbis, etc. today hint at, so they call him Hashem. They say his name is too holy to be pronounced, so they replace it with Hashem, right? Now it is clear from the rabbinic discussion of oaths that the people were afraid to use the name of God. Moreover, the better ones at least saw that swearing by God mostly showed a lack of true reverence. The name of God, or making an oath by God, right? The name of God, therefore, was often replaced by attributes of God or the like Hashem, etc., or Adonai. But as even these were feared and respected, less and less solemn expressions might take the place of oaths. For this and other reasons, it became necessary to lay down which phrases continued an oath and which did not. In Mishnah Shebuoth 4:13, for instance, it is provided that for certain purposes, by heaven and by earth is not an oath, but by the merciful and gracious is. In the Babylonian Gemara attached to this Mishnah, Shebuoth 36a, Eliezer takes the view that a mere ye or nay may constitute an oath, whereas in Rabbah's opinion, a yeah or nay is required. It is worth noting that several examples of yeah and nay being used for emphasis are quoted from rabbinic sources by Strak Billabak. They were living expressions. Surely all this supplies a sufficient background to Matthew 5:37, even as it stands. You may not resort, this is the meaning of the passage, to any of the dodges usual in oaths, or found in oaths. All you may do is say yeah, or yea, or nay. And the conclusion that this verse is intended to give us the maximum formula permissible is confirmed by the second half. For whatever is more than these cometh of evil, what comes of the devil, probably in your modern versions. As for the version in James 5:12, it is important to observe that the rabbinic illustrations adduced by Strachbilbeck are none of them concerned, like Matthew and the sections from Shavuot cited, with the proper mode of making binding declarations. In other words, none of them are concerned with the problem whether man, say small before God, has the right to take an oath, and what he can do if he has not. In the first case, R. Jose B. Judah comments on Leviticus 19:36. Just balances, just weights, a just ephah, or hephah, and a just hin shall ye have. Your nay shall be just, and your ye shall be just. The second case is the same as the first, except for the additional remark by Abaye. And down at the bottom here, footnotes, it has, these rabbis, it seems, rather lost sight of the nature of an oath. For us, at any rate, an oath involves the invocation of a superior power. But in this, as in every matter, the ultimate test in the eyes of the rabbis was Scripture, as they found there, or thought they found there, mere confirmations and denials with the force of oaths. They regarded it as sufficiently proved that a simple ye, yeah, or the like might be an oath. Compare also Philo, League.all 372 203 F, and just Ab it Kai. Just a reference to books you can check out to see what was said. You should not say one thing with your mouth and think another thing in your heart. It's like two-faced, right? You're double-minded, right? In the third case, R. Huna, in the name of R. Samuel B. Isaac, comments on Ruth 3:18. Then said she, sit still, my daughter, for the man will not be in rest until he have finished the thing to stay. The ye or year of the just is a year, and the nay is a nay. In all three passages, that is the theme is not the proper mode of making a binding declaration, but truthfulness and reliability. The two themes are closely related, but not quite the same. In James 5:12 alone, they appear to be combined. You may not swear by heaven, the earth, or any other oath. This sounds like a reference to the proper mode of giving an assurance. You may not go back on your mere confirmation or denial. This is an exhortation to be truthful and reliable, instead of, for whatever is more than these cometh of the devil. We find this the less specific, lest you fall into condemnation, or judgment, right, and perish. Debelius indeed seems to think that James 5:12 is confined to the theme of honesty, but this view can hardly be accepted. He relies on Pythagoras, but Pythagoras affords no real parallel. That sage, if we are to believe his biographers, forbade his disciples to swear by the gods, saying that every man ought to exercise himself as to be worthy of belief without an oath. Diogenes Laertius 8:22, and advised their ministers to surpass the common citizens in nothing but justice, adding that it was proper that the senators should not make use of any of the gods for the purpose of an oath, but that their language should be such as to render them worthy of belief without oaths, or their words, right? The words they use. And that's Jamblichus Vit Pith 47. This is a logical line of thought belonging exclusively to the theme of truthfulness and reliability, but it is different from James 5:12. It does recur significantly in Josephus' account of the Essenes, the Bell, Judges 2:8, 6, 135. And while any word counts with them as stronger than an oath, they avoid swearing, deeming it worse than perjury, for he stands condemned from the very outset, they say, who cannot be trusted without an invocation of God. James 5:12. And it's got down bottom here, compare Philo. The Essenes are here told attach the greatest importance to continued and uninterrupted purity throughout the whole of life, avoidance of oaths and avoidance of falsehood, etc. So they probably were proponents of chivalry, type of chivalry, right, etc., etc. And all they did or they said, etc., had to be that truth, that honesty. If they said, well, we'll do this for you, etc., etc., they weren't promising anything, making an oath. They just said, well, we'll do this for you, it will be done for you, and they did it, or it came about. So if they tripped up and it didn't happen, they can't say, well, you promised. Come on, man, you promised. It's a good thing to use in life, right? Never make promises, because promises are usually made to be broken, or they get broken, right? Now, don't make promises with women. Oh, if we get together, I'll take the sun out of the sky for you, all the stars out of the heavens, and all this sort of crap. Impossible. Not reality, it's fantasy, right? For you to win her over and fulfill your selfish desires or whatever, right? Yeah, depends on which way you look at it. Be honest in all you do, and just let your word be your word, and then go and do it. Don't make these silly promises or oaths that you can't back up. And it goes on about that. And it makes comparisons with other verses. Mark 10:6 uses a curious phrase which Torrey ascribes to mistranslation. There exists so close an analogy, however, in rabbinic literature, that this view must be rejected. The difference between Mark 10:6 and its parallel, Matthew 19:4, cannot be dissolved by assuming clumsiness on the part of a translator. Mark 10:6 in its present form reads, but from the beginnings of the creation, male and female made he them. Torrey substitutes at the beginning, the Creator made them, male and female. He remarks the text of the verse begins, mil quad men di bera, which might be rendered exactly as in Mark, the subject of the verb God being understood. But Matthew had the same text with the words possibly transposed, rendered correctly. See Matthew 19:4 and a note there. Mil kad min is the regular Jewish Aramaic for at the beginning. Torrey further argues that the traditional text of Mark cannot be right, seeing that God made man not at the beginning of the creation but at the end. Yeah, it's kind of confusing there, right? Like you've got the modern English, Americanized Bible versions, that there's two accounts that God made man in his image. He made them male and female out of his image, not from the dust or the earth or the soil or red clay. And you got the Genesis 2:7 scripture that says he made man alone, Adam first, right? And then from the rib he made Eve, the woman, and so forth. So there's two different accounts there. Some people say, oh, that's two different scribes, etc., etc., but maybe not, because in the original ancient Tab Eshet, the Aramaic, Brita, that's how it reads, that he makes these male and female, these humans, pre-Adamics, before he makes thee to be holy and spiritual of God, leading to the line of the children of God, the holy line. It comes through from Adam's son Seth, or Sehet, replacement for Abel, whom Cain killed. So yeah, Brita or Genesis, when translated into English, actually says pre-Adamics. Okay. The translator Victor Alexander uses the word Neanderthals, which we don't feel is correct. We've been told it's not correct either, because the Neanderthals came later. You probably got like Cro-Magnon or Homo erectus before the actual Adam, the Homo sapiens. And then God creates this special place within Eden, sacred and holy, before he made Adam from the dust or the dirt or the soil or the red clay. Okay, had it prepared and sanctified, made sacred, a holy place, and then he set him in there after he'd made him alone. Well, in the Brita, it sort of hints that he made Adam, he made them, right? It doesn't mention any female, so it could be plural there. He made them. So there might have been more than one Adam, right? Might have been a bunch of men. But it doesn't give the exact number of how many there were. Just drops that hint, right? At the beginning of the book, the creation is the Son of God, right? Because that's what it says in the Brita. As the beginning, in the beginning, as that beginning, the Nota, or the manifestation of God, created the heavens and the earth, the sky and the earth, etc. The sky and the earth and everything upon it, from the animals, vegetation, the trees, the fruit trees, whatever, and man, and then woman, right? Secondly, the desire to make these two texts say exactly the same is not new. It has been suggested that Matthew 19:4 is corrupt and at some stage was absolutely identical to Mark 10:6. See M.J. Lagran's evangelizing Saint Matthew, second edition, page 367. It looks like it's in French. It says Evangile selon Saint Matthew, something like that. I'm just guessing it means the evangelizing of Saint Matthew, somewhere along those lines. There are then a number of arguments in favour of Torrey's opinion, yet those against it are stronger. The first point to make one doubtful is the existence of another passage where Mark uses the term from the beginning of the creation, while Matthew does not. Mark 13:19 says, "For in those days shall be affliction, such as was not from the beginning of the creation." Matthew 24:21 says, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world." It is true that this time there is no difference in meaning between the evangelists, and also that whereas man, according to the plain biblical story, was not made in the beginning of the creation, which Mark 10:6 in its traditional form might be taxed with overlooking, it is perfectly natural to speak of troubles more fearful than any since the beginning of the creation, so that Mark 13:19 is safe on this account. Still, the fact remains that here is another instance where Mark alone employs just this phrase, and where a mistranslation of the kind assumed by Torrey in the case of 10 verse 6 is out of the question. A far more serious consideration is that mit hilath b'yatho shall olam, from the beginning of his creation of the world, is a frequent expression in rabbinic discourses on the creation. Sometimes indeed the phrase is used in its most literal sense. This happens particularly where God's perfect knowledge of everything to come is emphasized. In Genesis Rabbah 2, we are told, Abahu taught from the beginning of creation of the world, the Holy One saw the deeds of the righteous and the deeds of the wicked. According to Psalms 1:6, for the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. Or according to Genesis 1:2f, and the earth was without form and void. These are the deeds of the wicked, and God said, let there be light. These are the deeds of the righteous. Ahijah, the elder, taught from the beginning of his creation of the world, the Holy One saw the temple built, destroyed, and rebuilt. According to Genesis 1:1, if in the beginning God created this is the temple built, with Isaiah 51:16, that I may plant the heavens, and say unto Zion, thou art my people. And the earth was without form and void. This is the temple destroyed, with Jeremiah 4:23 ff. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void. So he basically saw it, and there's nothing on it. Who's saying that? Maybe that's God saying that. With Jeremiah 4:23 ff. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness. And God said, let there be light. This is the temple rebuilt, with Isaiah 61. F. Arise, shine, for thy light is come, for behold the darkness shall cover the earth, but the Lord shall rise upon thee. Here with God, seeing the end as it sets to work, we are not very far from Fitzgerald's Ye, the first morning of creation, wrote, what the last dawn of reckoning shall read. There seem, however, to have been rabbis against whom the same charge could be preferred as against Mark 10:6, namely a use of the expression under notice not in accordance with the strict biblical account of the creation. Genesis Rabbah 5a may be adduced. Eleazar taught from the beginning of his creation of the world, the Holy One decreed the floods, and said Genesis 1:9, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together. How? It is written twice, Amos 5:8 and 9:6. He that calleth for the waters of the sea and poureth them out upon the face of the earth. One references to the generation of the flood, and the other to the generation of Enosh. That there were two floods, one of them earlier than the familiar flood, namely in the time of Enosh, is an old midrashic view. In this passage, God is represented as having gathered the waters from the beginning of his creation of the world, despite the fact that the Bible makes this one of the works of the third day. The same midrash is recorded in Deuteronomy, Rabbah 10, where it is ascribed to Ahose B. Samra, and Ecclesiastes Rabbah in 3:14. In these two versions, the formulation is even clearer. We said Rabbah, where it's Rabbah. Our mistake. Thus spoke the Holy One from the beginning of his creation of the world. Let the waters be gathered in the former, or in one place, right? From the beginning of his creation of the world, it is said, let the waters be gathered in the latter. The interpretation of the Midrash here adopted is Barker's. C.W. Barker, the Agada de Palestinian Amore, looks like it's in German. Yeah, volume 2, page 51. It's a reference there, right? A somewhat less plausible way of taking it is to hold that the rabbis meant to establish a contrast between the gathering of the waters in Genesis 1:9 and the pouring out in Amos 5:8 and 9:6, the two floods, constituting a reversal of the original order. For the purpose of this discussion, it does not matter at all which interpretation is preferred on either of them. The words, let the waters be gathered, were regarded by R. Eleazar as uttered from the beginning of his creation of the world, God's creation of the world. Obviously, if it could be said that God gathered the waters from the beginning of his creation of the world, there is no reason why this phrase should have been inapplicable to the creation of man. But there is one more highly suggestive point. We find what God did from the beginning of his creation of the world, treated by the rabbis as an indication of what man ought to do. The relevance of this is the matter to the matter in hand is obvious. The relevance of this to the matter in hand is obvious. We have here part of the wider background of an argument like Mark 10:6 in its present form, and goes on and on. And there's some notes at the bottom. That it's a rabbinic interpretation of the verse. The English Bible has, and when ye shall come into the land and shall have planted all manner of trees, then. And second footnote, or note, a line of thought not dissimilar to that in the section on divorce here under discussion is to be found in the Testament of Zebulun 9:4. See D. Daube, or David Daube, his theology, page 47, page 67. The patriarch warns his children against political division, into two heads, since all that the Lord has made has received one head, and two shoulders, two hands, etc. But the term from the beginning of the creation does not occur. And then the Jerusalem Targum paraphrases something else, and it goes on like that. Here's something interesting here. Okay. We are told that an ideal creation in God's mind preceded the actual one, that God created everything on the first day, only the various works became manifest or extended in a certain succession, and so on. Another way of taking the term in Mark 10:6 literally would be to see it in a reference to the original state of man, when male and female were not yet two separate beings, as opposed to the final state now prevailing. It may be significant that it is precisely the clause, male and female made he them, the clause quoted in Mark 10:6, on which the Midrash, which has every mark of great antiquity, rests its teachings of the androgynous man, of the first man who was two, male and female, in one. So that's what it's trying to tell you there, that man was created in Genesis. When he says he created them, male and female, it actually means androgynous. We don't think so. Not in the original Aramaic Brita or Genesis in English. I don't think so. They didn't have like one body and two heads. No, don't think so. Mark 10:6 should have this. Mark 10:6 should this have to be regarded as relevant, would imply, but the very first time that man was created, male and female, in one, he made he them. If the verse was intended to be understood in this way, evidently the argument against divorce was very powerful indeed. However, this may be to alter Mark 10:6 by assuming a mistranslation is unfortunately too simple a solution. One remark may be added in conclusion, though it has been made by others before. The fact that Mark 10:6 says male and female made he them, with God as the subject merely implied, should not be urged in justification of emendations, and Torrey does not do it. These words are a literal quotation of Genesis 1:27 and 5:2, passages with which any Jewish audience, educated or uneducated, was thoroughly familiar, and the insertion of God would have made the reference less rather than more intelligible. And then he goes on about Mark 10:2. Sorry, Mark 10:12. About a woman, if she leaves her husband, puts him aside, she's still married, and she goes with some other guy, that's adultery, because they're like two betrothed or two married people. It's not fornication. Fornication is when she goes with this other person, lays with that guy, has sexual intercourse with that guy. That's fornication. Because they're married, she's married, she's then an adulteress. And if she who has been divorced by her husband marries another, he committeth adultery. The reason he gives us, the Jewish woman at this time could not divorce her husband. See Josephus, Antiquities, Judea, 15:17 at the beginning. The reading here in Mark was not patra legabra, putting away her husband, but petera legabra, put away by her husband. And the following verb was masculine. Observe that this is exactly what is said in Luke 16:18. Once again, however, there is another side to the matter. Certainly a Jewish wife under Jewish law could not divorce her husband, and Mark 10:12 therefore sounds odd. Certainly by amending the passage as Torrey does, we get the same sense as in Luke 16:18, or that for that matter in Matthew 5:32b and 19:9b. Only if it seems that in the case under notice, if we adopt the method outlined, we are suppressing an interesting piece of textual and general history. A Jewish woman under Jewish law could not divorce her husband, but she could and apparently sometimes did run away from him. Halach yasa, parash in Hebrew, mfak pirash in Aramaic. The possibility is contemplated by Paul in 1 Corinthians 17f. Indeed, the rule that a wife ought not to separate from her husband, and that if she does, she ought not to marry another, precedes the rule that a husband must not divorce his wife. Let not the wife depart from her husband, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, and let not the husband put away his wife. The point is that there is extant a variant reading of Mark 10:12, putting precisely this case. In D, the verse begins, and if a woman shall depart from her husband, not, and if a woman shall put away her husband. And strikingly enough, the same text underlies some version of the Itala. Actually, most of the codices known to the present writer, this David Daube, have a text compatible with Jewish law, namely MSS or manuscripts, or certain manuscripts, right? So apparently in the scripture it says that you can't break away from your husband and not divorce him. You can't divorce him according to the law. You can't remarry unless he dies. It's something like that. There's all this tight law, right? Again, if you run off and you mess with another man and you're still married and you lay with them, have those sexual pleasures, then you are deemed an adulteress, a fornicating adulteress. And he goes on more about that, and he's going on about Salome and Herodias' actions. So basically it's a review of C.C. Torrey's claims of the Aramaic originals, and this guy D. Daube refuting them, saying, well, that's not right, that's not right, using scripture. It's quite an interesting book. There's a lot here to have a look at, so it'll be a really good read. How many pages has it got? Roughly maybe 38 or more. Could be even more. It looks like it's a copy of that book or something like that. Very interesting. As you know, we, the Minister of the Real Truth, are following the original ancient, very old Tav Esheret, Nishana Atika, Aramaic Old Testament, and the Galilean Aramaic New Testament translated into the nearest English equivalent by a native born Aramaic translator from Mesopotamia, Syria. So yeah, we can look at the Aramaic scriptures and also make comparisons with the modern Americanized English translations that all have today. And it's quite amazing because, you know, being from a normal Christian churchgoer, baffled by these different questions. Okay, Christians say there's only Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. There's no one else. And suddenly you come across a verse where it says Cain's talking with God because God found out he killed his brother. The blood's on his hand, crying out to him from the soil, all that sort of stuff. And so it says, you killed your brother, right? Okay, you're out of here, out of my presence. Okay, and you're going to be a nomad, wandering in a desert area, the land of Nod, the land of wandering, and all this sort of stuff. And then Cain starts to panic because he goes into this unknown land to be a nomad, an Arab, which means, in this definition, means he's a desert wanderer. He lives there in tents, etc., moves around a lot, and he raises goats and sheep. That's what it means in the true sense. Not a Muslim or Arabic Islamic affiliate, none of that rubbish. Okay, where these imams say, oh, Adam was the original, he was a Muslim, or it's total baloney, right? Because Islam didn't come around to about the 6th to 7th century, right? Or maybe a little earlier there. Yeah, so no, they weren't Muslims. You know, Ishmael wasn't a Muslim, as far as we know, or Muhammadan, whatever. It came about with Muhammad, right? There's possibility that it was somebody earlier than him, but not from the Adamic Garden of Eden, right? Don't believe that baloney. Okay, so if you found this really interesting, you want to read it for yourself, making the comparisons with your modern Bible, etc. Whatever reasons, well then we'll leave the link to it at the bottom or underneath this video, so you can do that. It's free, it's in the public domain, public access, no problem there. Access is free, it's easy, no problem. If you like this video, then give us a like, add your comments below the video, and we'll get back to you on those as soon as we can.